I want to talk a little bit about trying to write this book. I'm going to assume that some of you may read it, so you might not be so interested in the short version of everything that's in it, and I thought you might be interested in trying to write a book like this. Good evening. It's delightful to be here. I'm going to ask for your help on a couple of points. I'm a first-time author. This is my first book, and I've discovered all kinds of interesting things. People come up and give you a book to sign, and they tell you how to spell 2 or 3 names, which you're remembering, and then they keep talking while you're trying to write it, you know, Carol with an E, Murray with a Y-E, you know, that kind of thing. I just found out I'm supposed to repeat your questions. So we're all going to work on that as a group to make sure that the question is appropriately repeated when it's my turn to repeat your questions. And I certainly, I do intend to talk, but the questions I see is a big part of what we'll be doing as a group this evening. Will be my trying to answer your questions as well as I can, as we have a relatively small and congenial group, so we can certainly have some time to discuss things. I want to say before we talk about Hyde Park, I want to talk a little bit about the Newbury, because it's just so exciting to be here. This is such a wonderful place. Americans talk a very great deal, mostly nonsense, about how much they care about books and reading. I think people lie more about how much they read than anything else except how often they go to church or synagogue or mosque. And so it's wonderful to be in a library that has a bookstore. If we didn't have bookstores and publishers, what would we put in the libraries? And to have the understanding that a library needs a bookstore, that in fact libraries and bookstores and publishers and all of us who are readers and trying to write need all of those institutions, I think is wonderful. And in Hyde Park, we have a lot of libraries and we have a lot of bookstores. We don't have a library with a bookstore in it yet. So that is a very wonderful thing. I used to come to this library one summer. I was an undergraduate at the University of Sussex in Great Britain, which is near Brighton, and I came here to read the newspapers. It was a British socialist newspaper called the Clarion, which happens to be all preserved in this library. And these were these wonderful young people who rode their bicycles through rural England, distributing socialist tracts and forming these little activist groups where they continued their education and tried to plan strategies for social reform at a very personal grassroots level. And I remember that the professor I worked with said, "Rebecca, that's a lovely idea that you want to write about these groups and with the bicycles and the newspapers." He said, "It's so interesting." He said, "It's such an odd choice. Undergraduates who are learning about socialism here all want to write about Gramsci and Althusser and theoretical constructs. And you want to write about these little groups of citizens. I think you Americans call them activists." I said, yes, we call them activists. And he said, "What an interesting choice." Okay, he didn't know where I grew up. My whole life has been observing groups of activists, being in the occasional group of activists, and occasionally fearing groups of activists. And so that goes way back, that interest. And this library was the most wonderful place to study activism in total peace and quiet under the most supportive conditions for a scholar that could exist. So I have to mention that. I want to talk a little bit about trying to write this book. I'm going to assume that some of you may read it, so you might not be so interested in the short version of everything that's in it, and I thought you might be interested in trying to write a book like this. I have always had a certain mixture of fear and respect for people writing books, because I live in a community that's full of people lugging through life their unfinished dissertations. You start these things with high hopes. And this is why when I was writing the book, I told only those that was absolutely necessary to know that I was writing the book. I did not want this to turn into one of these things where in a couple years people were saying, so how's the book? Because I had seen that happen to so many people. In the beginning, you say, how's the dissertation? Ah, great. I mean, I have a new thing. This is a wonderful thing. This is going to move scholarship forward. 2, 3 years, how's the dissertation? It's okay, I'm working. 4, 5, 6, 12, 14 years, you know, it's more depressing, you know, for both sides of the conversation. So I was not going to let that happen to me. And I think, and then when people found out about the book, as occasionally they did, they would ask me what it was. And I said, it's a history of Hyde Park. So that was a very short and good answer. It is not in any way, shape, or form a history of Hyde Park. And that was not what I was trying to do. It only occurred to me really when I was finished what I was trying to do, which is it's about some of the history that happened in Hyde Park. It's not a history of Hyde Park. So all of my neighbors who pick it up and flip through the index and say, where's the Eagle? Where's Stavers? How come you didn't write about Laura Fairmay? It's not a history of Hyde Park. It's about history that happened in Hyde Park. Because I honestly thought, before I started writing the book, and maybe even a little bit more afterwards, that it was history that's important to a lot of other places besides Hyde Park. And that was the part of the history that happened in Hyde Park I was trying to focus on. And I did not ever, it's not a short book just because I ran out of steam. That's true, but it's not the only reason. I was really trying to keep it to the point where I could try and share what I felt was important about the history that happened in Hyde Park with quite a few other people. And Hyde Park really does a constant theme all the way through the history that happened in Hyde Park is the group of citizens, the concerned group of citizens. And you go back to the very beginning, all right, there was Paul Cornell, gets off the train, buys this huge tract of cheap land, has the brilliant idea, which they call transit-based planning now, but in those days it was just a good idea, to get the train and tie this community that was at that point quite far away from the city and the problems of the city directly to the city by the train and build a lovely community on this lakefront section. But by the time Hyde Park joined the city of Chicago, and remember that it was annexed and both sides had to agree. It wasn't a conquest. Both sides had to vote to agree to be annexed. And it's interesting to compare the annexation of Hyde Park with the annexation that didn't happen of Evanston, which would have been about a decade later. And a similar community looked at a similar set of issues and made a different decision. It was a hotly contested decision within Hyde Park, whether to go in or not. And when you look back at it, you kind of wonder if the city knew what they were letting themselves in for. Because by that point, it wasn't just Paul Cornell and a few founders. There was a whole group of people. And they had a couple of characteristics. They were very confident people. They were self-confident people. They were very well educated, and they were very critical. And that just, the composition of that group of citizens changes for race and gender and ethnicity, and there's a more income variation, but those characteristics of confident, well-educated, critical, no variation there. That's at the beginning, that stays consistent all the way along. And that group of people and that community found themselves in a city that was not organized to their liking. And they went immediately to city council and started casting those dissenting votes and started to talk about the need, not just to defend their own interests, but to reorganize the whole city. That's one thing that people always prepared to do in Hyde Park was discuss how to reorganize the whole city. Those reorganization plans were never confined to the small territorial limits of Hyde Park. And at the same time, A series of incredible investments were made in Hyde Park. A new kind of university was built there that at one point was the fastest growing university in the United States. An enormous investment was made there. A public investment was made in the World's Fair and in the park system. So a lot of investments were made in that community, and more people came. The Jewish community grew, other communities grew, the neighborhood became diverse. And it was really a place that people valued within the city. At the same time, it was located very close to the Black Belt, where really interesting political things were happening in Chicago for a long time. When black people got to Chicago, they couldn't buy houses in most of the city. Many, many jobs were not available to them. There were lots of things you couldn't do, but you could vote. And there were white politicians who were very committed to seeing that you could vote. Not because they wanted to help you buy those houses, move into those neighborhoods, or get those jobs, but they wanted to see those votes. And the Black Belt, as it was called, very close to Hyde Park, was intensely, by modern standards, almost unimaginably populated. And there is strength in numbers. And there is strength in using your political clout, even in a city where the politics was never clean and the playing field was never even. You could really move forward. And Chicago sent a congressman, a black congressman, to Washington long before anybody else did. And really important black politicians, nationally important black politicians, came out of Chicago. At the same time, you had this ongoing reform movement. In the beginning, the scholars looked at the city and were very critical. They thought that the University of Chicago was very committed to studying the city. They thought they had a lot of insights into the city. And they wanted to put their knowledge to work. And they felt when they went out and tried to do that, they walked straight into some crooked politician that made stupid decisions and didn't even care what the real information was. I always think the classic story is Charles Merriman. And they call Obama a professor because he taught a couple classes at the law school. The man was not a professor, okay? Charles Merriman was a professor. Paul Douglas was a professor. Those are people who carried a full course load and published. I mean, if we're going to use professor as an insult, let's reserve it for people who are actually professors. I mean, Barack Obama was never in line to be department chair, okay? Let's be clear about this. But we sent actual politicians into politics from Chicago. And his great triumph, Merriman's great triumph, was when he proved with the city's own records that they had paid an enormous amount of money to pull this hard rock out of a tunnel, and their own records showed it was oozing soft mud. And that was the kind of information that Hyde Parkers believed then and continued to believe for a long time would set democracy free. If you just really let people know what was going on, they would join in your cause and they would reform government and decisions would be made in a way that benefited everybody and not the few. And they repeatedly went into battle under that banner and they lost. They kept coming so close, you couldn't believe it. I mean, Charles Merriman lost that election in so close. His son, we always think that the hereditary politics is on the other side. Not entirely. Merriman's son lost a very tight election in 1955 to the first Richard Daley. We forget that now because we think there was like a dynasty and the sword came up when the stone, it was actually an election. It was actually a contested election. And when you look back at it, it was a fantastically interesting election because the blacks voted for Daley. The reformers at that time were not making a pitch to the black community. At that time, they saw the black community as a problem to be solved, not a source of allies, not where the energy for reform was going to come.